It's a great honor and a privilege to introduce Ruth Galai. Your maiden name is Stein. Ruth, you have a unique story in that your parents obtained a Sugihara visa.
Right.
So could you let us know how they, a bit of background and how they got to get the Sugihara visa?
Okay, with pleasure. My father was born in Krakow, Poland, in 1905, and my mother's family was also from Krakow, but she was born in Vienna because of World War I. They went for a few years until the end of the war. So she was born in 1915 in Vienna, and then they went back to Krakow. And my father went to school for the classics, a high school where they learned Greek and Latin. And my mother went to the Hebrew Gymnasium. She was in the same class with my future in-laws, and the mothers were best friends. And she grew up in a very Zionist, in an Orthodox home, but Zionist. And when she finished school, she went for a law degree at the Jagiellonian University. My father went also at the Jagiellonian University. He studied medicine. He was 10 years older than she was. And then they got married in 1938 in Krynica, in a hotel that my grandfather owned, Kryniczanka.
This was in Poland?
In Poland, yeah, in southern Poland. He had a kosher Jewish hotel. It was an Orthodox family. And then, they had a very good life there. They loved Krakow. On their honeymoon, they went to Venice and Paris, and wonderful life. 1938, who would have believed? And then before the war started, my father really believed that Hitler means business. He read Mein Kampf, and he told his mother, "We have to leave Poland in the 1930s, even in 1937, 8." And she said, "I'm an old woman of 56, nobody will hurt me, and what are you talking about?" And he said, "If you stay, we stay," he and his brother Kalman. And he didn't believe, nobody could have imagined the Holocaust, but he believed that Hitler really means business. But they were still there in 1939, and a few days before the outbreak of the war, my mother's family decided to escape east from Krakow. With 100 Persian rugs. They
Wow.
rented a big thing, I don't know, a big car or something, and they escaped east. Now, there were 11 people at the time. Actually, there were 12. It was my my grandmother, my grandfather on my mother's side, my father's mother, my parents, 2 aunts, an uncle, and 2 cousins, and I hope I didn't miss anyone. And then there was the little 1.5-year-old baby, my cousin Anita, whose parents were on vacation in Nice. People just didn't believe that this was going to happen. So she, with her Polish nanny, joined the group as well. And they were 11, and there was one more. My mother's cousin, Clara, age 14, started the escape with them. Unfortunately, a month later, her mother panicked and said, "Come back to Krakow, it's safer here." She didn't survive. Her brother is now 97, living in Sydney, and we see him every year the last 7 years. So they escaped to Lublin. There was not a resort, but there was a wealthy family which were friends of theirs. My mother's family was a wealthy family. My grandfather had a sugar packing factory. He was known as the Sugar King in Krakow. And so they escaped to their friends were accepting, had all of their friends coming. They had a full house there. They had my father writes about it as a manor. I mean, it was a big country estate. That's what it was. And they came there. That was the first step of their escape. My father didn't go with them because he was a young doctor at the hospital, and he stayed for another few days with the patients. And then he decided to join the Polish army. And he went to the Polish army, and making a long story short, In the end, he was given a pass for 48 hours, which he ended up tearing up, and he went on his way and got in touch with the family and continued escaping with them. They were caught at some point. They got to Lvov later on, and that was already under Russian. The Russians were there.
That's when they had partitioned Poland.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm making a long story short, but because I don't have the exact dates of each thing, but this was still at the beginning of the war, and they got to Lvov, and what they wanted to do is to get out of the Soviet Union or anything to do with the Russians or the Nazis, of course, but the Nazis hadn't come yet to where they were in Lvov, and they tried this way and that way, and they ended up trying to cross the border to Lithuania, and they got caught by the Russians, and they started to be interrogated. Now, my father had 2 degrees. I forgot to mention that before he became a doctor, he did a PhD in philosophy, and he was a bright guy. And they started.
And did he study in Poland?
In Poland, the Jagiellonian University, and it's all written in his memoirs also. And they especially interrogated him. They interrogated all of them, but especially him. And he played the village fool. He said, "Border? What border? The Russians are here. The Russians are there. Border?" He played, and they finally gave up on him because they thought he was a total idiot. He played it very well. And they were put in. It was like a prison. It was a makeshift prison kind of thing, and they were put there, all of them. Milk was brought for the baby for my cousin, who lives. She lives here in Talpiot, and at some point they were freed. It took a few, I think maybe 2 weeks or something like that, or maybe a little bit more. And then they made their way to Lithuania, and they got to Vilna. And in Vilna, I guess that they heard that in Kovno, the Japanese consul they heard the rumor. So my father and my uncle went to Kovno to see what's going on, and it was true, brought the family there. And they got the visas, all of them, no questions asked. And at that point, they were, my cousin and my little baby cousin and her Polish nanny got a visa to France, and they flew to France, which is unbelievable, from Lithuania. And so the 9 of them got visas, and then they made their way to...
Can I ask what number visa?
Number 40. Well, my father was 40, my paternal grandmother was 41, and my mother 42. And the rest of the family were on the next page of the visas. They're like 50 and 60 something. I don't have the number in my head right now. But
and the Zwartendijk Curaçao entry visa?
Yeah, they got the Zwartendijk Dutch visas for Curaçao, and then they went to the Japanese. I'm sorry, I skipped that. And then they made their way to Moscow, and my father describes Moscow 1940, October 1940, very gray, very, people were afraid. It was Stalin's Russia, it wasn't a joke. He was also on the way offered a position in to be a physician in a Czech, how do you call it, resort, one of the bads, where you go for treatments. And they gave him an offer to become the head doctor of this, and he said, "Over my dead body, I'm not staying in the Soviet Union for anything." And and they ended up on the Trans-Siberian Express. And he writes, he said he woke up one morning on the, and I mean, this was the war, but he had a sense of humor and a sense of history and everything. He said, "My goodness, I never believed I would ever see the Lake Baikal, all the beautiful things we saw along the way." Anyway, they ended up in Vladivostok, and All I've said until now is a whole year. It's 13 months.
Did your father ever speak about meeting Zwartendijk or Sugihara?
No, I never. He just said that when they came, Sugihara was standing on the staircase when they came to the consulate in Kovno, and they got the visas. They got the visas. That's the only time he mentions the actual meeting. And if he were alive now, I would have a million questions to ask him. And
Zwartendijk, did he ever speak about him, or?
No, just the name, came up, but no details of.
Because he was also made Chasidei Motelam, Zwartendijk, but that was after he passed away. They gave him Chasidei Motelam.
No, they never mentioned, personally having met. And of course, they would have loved to talk much more if we kids had been interested in those days. My father would say, well, you probably haven't read my memoirs, which I hadn't. And I would have had a lot more if I had known, if I had spoken and asked. And then they took the train to Vladivostok, and they got on the Japanese ship to Tsuruga. And they said, and they always talked about it, how the Japanese porters at the in the port were so helpful and so kind to them, and insisted when they heard that they're taking a third-class train to Tokyo, they insisted on giving them money so that they can take second class.
Wow.
And they didn't even, these are total strangers. And my parents had. Luckily, my mother was from a wealthy home, and they couldn't take money with them. They couldn't take anything out of the Soviet Union. But they wired money to Yokohama in advance. So a day or two later, they sent the money to the porters. They took their address, and they sent back the money that the porters had given them.
They didn't go to Kobe, did they go straight to Tokyo?
They went straight to Tokyo.
Really?
And we went 3 years ago. We were there. We went to see the hotel where they stayed, which is no longer there. It's been
refurbished?
Restored. Shiputs.
Refurbished.
The Imperial Hotel, which is it was quite they have a model of how it looked in 1940. I mean, they're really amazing. They stayed there, and after a while, and for them, I think of these Krakow Jews, in the middle of Japan in those days was isolated, and to think of them in eating sushi or whatever, I can't imagine it. And at some point they decided that since Japan is with Germany, they're allies of Germany, they're better off leaving, although the people really they had a good experience in Japan.
How long did they stay in Japan?
I think it was 2 months, and they stayed in Tokyo the whole time. And then they decided to leave, and they got on a boat, which was going towards the United States. By the way, they had been trying to get a certificate to Palestine from the beginning. Of course, it didn't work. So their other option was the United States, or whoever will take them. So they got on a boat. The boat went to Los Angeles. They weren't allowed off the boat. And then at first it started in San Francisco, I'm sorry. They weren't allowed off. The boat went down to Los Angeles. They weren't allowed off. So the boat continued on to Mexico.
Is this because they were Jewish?
Yeah, and they didn't have a visa. They had no visa to the United States. And they got to Mexico, and they weren't allowed off. So my father wrote a note as a doctor that his mother needs medical help. So they got 24 hours to get off the boat, and they got off, and they ran, and they left, and they ended up in Mexico City. And
the whole family?
The whole family, all 9 of them. It's unbelievable that all 9 of them. Now I must say there's something else I didn't mention during their travels across Poland and Russia, etc. They decided on a theory of limited responsibility. That you can't make a decision. They had a lot of decisions to make. Do we escape to here now or not? Will it snow? Will it be raining? Will there be soldiers over there, Russian soldiers, or over there? What do you do? So they made they decide they're not responsible for everything, and it made it much easier to make decisions. And my father wrote that, in some places like in Lvov or in Vilna also, they knew, usually it was basically still in Poland, like in Lvov, which was already under the Russians, some of their neighbors knew that they're planning, they want to get away, they want to get to Palestine at that time, and said, no, you shouldn't go, you've got older people with you. They were in their 50s, the older people. You've got a baby of a year and a half. How are you can't do that, it's dangerous for them. They decided they're not listening to any of those things. Most of those people didn't survive because they were, well, how can we go in the snow through the forest with a 50-year-old or a 60-year-old? They did it. And so that was one very important thing which I think helped them. The other thing was my grandfather, who was Orthodox, right when on the day that they started the escape from Krakow, he took the family together and he said, from now on, look, we don't know how long the war will be, we don't know where we're going to be getting food. From now on, we eat what we can get. And he meant it. So at every meal, my parents always talked about it, that at every meal, whenever they found food, wherever they were, my grandparents would find something to do in the other room or outside so that the young people would feel free to eat whatever they're eating.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah, and bread in Poland was also made from lard, very often. So he always said, you eat what you can get. And they just, sort of turn their backs to make it, which was also a thing of, Jews saving Jews, because many people, wouldn't eat because it wasn't kosher. And which I can understand if somebody, really was keeping kosher his whole life and suddenly, God knows what they were given to eat.
When you speak about the boat and they weren't allowed to embark from San Francisco and Los Angeles, it's like the St. Louis, where it came and it was turned back.
Yeah, and they were going to turn them back. They told them they're going to have to go back. But they ended up in Mexico, and they got to Mexico City, and somewhere we had the article in one of the newspapers in Spanish about Familia Judía, and after my father died, it disappeared. We don't know what happened to it, where it said there's a Jewish family that's hiding in Mexico City. It's insane, And my father was a very good diagnostician. And rumor went around the European community in Mexico City that there's a European doctor that arrived and he's good with diagnosis. So people started coming to him. He didn't have a license. He was totally illegal.
Wow.
My sister was born there. My sister Anna, she was born at the end of the 7th month of pregnancy. And after a day or two in the hospital, my father said, the only way this girl is going to survive is if we get her out of this hospital in Mexico City. And she later on became a professor of pathology in the United States, etc. After 2 years, they got a visa to the United States. That wasn't what they really wanted, but, And they came into the United States, and it was Thanksgiving Day, 1942. And they had no idea what Thanksgiving was. They didn't know English either. They knew German and Latin and Greek and French and also Yiddish, although they didn't speak Yiddish. They were anti-Yiddish. And all over, they saw signs in Texas where they went through Laredo, Texas. That was where they went into the United States. Turkey famine. They thought there was a famine in Turkey.
Oh my goodness.
There was a turkey famine that year. And they ended up in New York. My aunt and uncle had already gotten to New York. They had already gotten a visa a little bit earlier from Mexico, and they were already there. And in 1977, my father made Aliyah. My mother died in New York. She was sick for many years, but she's buried here. And that's, that was their story. It was. They were very lucky.
And your father practiced medicine here?
He practiced medicine in New York. He was at Mount Sinai Hospital in New York, internal medicine.
Did he have to requalify, or they just?
Yeah. That's he had to take exams, but he didn't know a word of English, and they allowed him to do the entire thing in Latin.
Wow.
And he wrote it, not only the medical terms, which many of them are in Latin, but he did the entire exam in Latin. They sent me to the mountains. I was 2 years old. I was born in 1947. And my father had to do the medical boards. And so they sent me to the mountains to a place called Children's Colony for 2 months. And he did the medical boards. He passed them. And he had a private practice and was on the staff of Mount Sinai. And my mother never practiced law. As a matter of fact, she and my mother-in-law were at the end of their doctorate, and in September 1939, they had their defense of their thesis that they were supposed to do at the Jagiellonian University. And my in-laws had come to Israel to visit their parents who had come here in 1937. They came for 3 weeks with summer clothing, and then the war broke out. They never went back, obviously. And on the 1st of September, my mother-in-law wrote a letter to my mother in Krakow asking her to please go to the office of the doctoral students to ask if they can postpone the defense by, a week or two until things calm down. That's how people were thinking. And the letter never reached my mother, because my mother had left on the 27th of August already with her family. So it came back here, and it now is at the museum of the Holocaust Museum in Washington. We have the letter, together with letters of my husband's other grandparents who didn't survive. Until 1942, they were writing, and the letters were getting worse and worse,
So they escaped in August, just before the 1st of September.
4 days before the war broke out,
and they really gave up quite a lot.
They gave up a tremendous amount.
Do you think you're going to get your doctorate and in a matter of weeks?
Yeah. They gave up a lot, but they understood that they better get out.
Can I ask Ruth, how did your father read Mein Kampf? Did he know German?
Yeah, they knew German. Oh yeah, they studied German. German was what English is today in the world. Today everything is in English. Internet, etc. In those days, German, and his German was very good. Many years later, I took German here in Jerusalem, and he was still alive. So sometimes I asked him to help me with homework, and when I would read the answer to the teacher, he said, "Das ist Hochdeutsch. Dein Vater hat das gemacht." Your father must have done this homework. This is good German, very high German. It wasn't my German. And we had a good time. He would help me with it, and it was fun for him, and I got my answers.
So
but the teacher always caught me.
Reading Mein Kampf, in a way, saved your family's life, in a way.
In a way, yeah. And also, I think my father had a very wide and long vision of the world. As he writes in his memoirs, that no story of his life can be complete without talking about the historical and philosophical this and that of the era, and then he goes into the history of what was the Austro-Hungarian this and that. So he had he never was a person who thought that the world started when he was born. It was. But yeah, could be that reading Mein Kampf had because he said he believed every word that Hitler means what he's writing.
That's amazing, because a lot of people just thought he was crazy and it's going to pass. And
yeah, because that's natural. I mean, who thinks, you're at home, you've got a beautiful grand piano, who's going to, why should we go running away? We'll stay, it'll pass, like you said. Yeah, but he wasn't of that opinion. And luckily my grandfather as well. And so it's amazing that they all survived, except for Clara, who left them a few weeks after they began the escape. And but who could have known what was better? I don't know if my kids would be escaping with family somewhere and I'm sitting in my comfortable home. Wouldn't I think, she'll be better off at home.
It's very difficult decisions.
Impossible to know what the right decision was. And they really, like the thing of the limited responsibility, My aunt, my mother's youngest sister is still alive. She lives in New York, north of New York City. And she was 16 at the time, and she had hepatitis. And she wrote her memoirs. And when I was reading her memoirs, my father was a very good doctor, but he was a tough cookie. There was no such thing as, you don't feel well, stay in bed. Yeah. We never missed a day of school. I tried to forge his signatures many times. I tried to make chicken pox with magic markers. Didn't work. Nothing worked. You don't feel well, you go to school, you'll feel better. And I was reading her memoirs, and she was writing how it was the day that they had planned that they're going to escape over the border on the 31st of December, because then the soldiers will be drunk and they'll be less efficient. And that was their decision. Now, there was snow. It was like minus 30 degrees or minus 20 degrees. And she was very sick. And she writes in her, I started reading the first part of the sentence where she writes, well, Emek, who was my father, Emmanuel, Emek came over to me and said, as a doctor, I have to tell you, you have to stay in bed or whatever she was sleeping in. And I said, she's wrong. She was there, I wasn't, but I was born after the war. But I said, impossible. He couldn't have said that, she's wrong. And then I continued the rest of the sentence. But as your brother-in-law, I tell you, you've got to get the hell up and out. Wow. Because if you don't come now, then we all stay here and we'll all be finished. So they took chances. They had made that decision and they decided to do it. And that's funny that I was correcting her when I only read half a sentence. I wasn't there. But I knew his character. I knew how he was as a doctor as well with his patients. And he always said, get up, do whatever you can do, get up. Don't lie in bed if you can help it, And that was also a great help, because they didn't, it's cold outside, we'll wait till tomorrow. Yeah.
Did your father speak a lot about his experiences through the years? Did he speak about...
He spoke, and he wanted to speak much more, but we as kids, we didn't really pay attention, unfortunately, not enough. And today I would have asked a million questions. I knew the facts. I never asked how they felt, or how, I've heard from many people the same thing, that they, as kids, didn't want to...
They wanted to protect the children in a way.
No, our parents, no, they never wanted to protect us. They should know everything, but we didn't want to hear. We were busy with our ice skating and, life.
And did he search for family members or friends after the war?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there were lists. And my aunt worked in, the one who had been in Nice when the war broke out, she ended up also getting to New York. And she worked at the office where they were getting the lists of survivors. So she was the one actually who would go over them at work very often. My grandmother was one of 12 children. She was the only one who survived. Wow. And not only the only one of her siblings, but also their spouses. She was the only one. And I think of her in New York City, always with pearls and a hat, and walking on Riverside Drive, playing bridge with her friends. And I knew she had lost 11 brothers and sisters, but I never thought about it until I got much older. She was so full of life and everything, but she was the only one. And it's on her grave here. It's written in memory of her 11 brothers and sisters. And most of the people didn't survive. I have a picture of I'll show you afterwards, of our mothers, of my mother-in-law and my mother with their two best friends. There were 4 of them, and 2 of them were killed during the war, and 2 survived. So we heard about it a lot. We heard about the people. I heard a lot about Clara, my mother's cousin. She never got over that that beautiful Clara could have been saved, but who knew? They talked a lot, but there was also a lot of talking with even sometimes with a sense of humor of specific situations. As my father wrote in his memoir somewhere, as most terrible situations, there are very often, inside that, there's very often something humorous that happens. And well, they were very lucky.
And in their circle of friends, did they have a lot of also Holocaust survivors?
Absolutely. We never had any, when I think about it, I was born in New York, the only one in the family. They never had any American-born friends.
Really?
And now when I read his memoirs over, I skimmed through it this morning and last night to make sure that I didn't, forget something or mix up something. And I see all the names of their friends, and they were all one that he met on the way to Lvov, and they sat on something together on a bus, and they ended up being their very best friends. And Dr. Malowist and Bishovsky and all these familiar names from my childhood, they were all people that from before, but very often many of them from that year when they were escaping, and they met this one or that one, or rented a room somewhere in Lvov and were next door to somebody, Dr. Drugi, who ended up being an obstetrician in New York. All of them. There was Dr. Temchin, who was in the Partisans. I have the book, The Witch Doctor. We never had anyone without an accent in the house.
So they didn't really integrate with American...
In a way they did, but no.
Socially,
but their friends,
in a social way.
Socially, there was no real contact. I think that and they always had the encyclopedia open, and they were discussing, something in far off history in Mongolia, and they would discuss with their friends, and it was a completely different cultural atmosphere in the house. We didn't have ketchup in the house. And peanut butter. And they considered, they considered the United States not their home. They always told us this is temporary. We're thankful to the United States for everything, but our place is in Israel.
Really, that's very interesting. They instilled the love of Zionism.
They were Zionists, through and through. And my father ended up living here for 20 years.
Did he practice medicine when he came here?
No, but they used to call him sometimes to Hadassah when there was a difficult case to diagnose, because he was good in that. Not everyone liked his, get up and take a walk, but in diagnosis he was really excellent. So sometimes they would call him to come on the rounds and see what he says. Because he also tells the story of once in Mexico when he was working illegally. A patient came, a Jewish German wife brought her husband who was dying. And it was just sort of a last thing she heard. There was a doctor, and she brought him, and he was told he's got no more than a week or two. And while he was in my father's, I was going to say office, but it wasn't an office, we're in the room there, he fainted, the patient, and my father said in German, he said, "Das ist wunderbar." And the wife looked at him, and she was very angry. "How are you saying this is wonderful? My husband just fainted, he's on the floor." My father said, "Because that completes my diagnosis. Your husband is going to be fine."
Wow.
And they ended up later on becoming patients in New York. The guy lived until the age of 90-something.
Unbelievable.
But he always liked to tell with a twinkle in his eyes, how he said, "Das ist wunderbar, this is wonderful, he's fainted on the floor." That completes, So, but they really always we went to Hebrew-speaking camps, Jewish summer camps, where we had to speak Hebrew. I was a rebel, I didn't want to speak, but as I was getting into trouble sometimes, but little did I know I would end up here speaking Hebrew in my sleep. And they had an interesting life.
And can I ask, with your friends, were you open about your parents being Holocaust survivors? And
Yeah, it wasn't that much of an issue, but I always felt a little bit different. Like, we were always dressed practically. You know, you dressed in dark blue or black or brown, and you don't have 3 pairs of shoes that match. Like, you know, my American-born, my friends whose parents were American-born, there was something different about them. Maybe more frivolous, I don't know. But it's funny, every year in the United States you change classes. It's not like here where you go into 1st grade and until 6th grade you're with the same kids. They jumble it up every year. So every year I would sit in the class the first day of school, and I was pretty shy then. And I would sit and look at the kids in the class and sort of point out to myself who I think my good friends will be. Wow. And it was usually children of, with the exception of one, they were usually children of either immigrants or survivors, or because they weren't dressed in pink and yellow and pastels and all sorts of ribbons. Very different, yeah.
Can we have a look at the book?
Absolutely.
This is the memoirs that your.
What?
This is the book that your father wrote.
It's memoirs. He wrote it in the form of letters to my sister because she asked him to do it, thank God. And so he wrote...
And Ruth, you wouldn't have it published for the general public?
We
I
can.
think it would be so interesting for people to...
And I think we can add...
It's looking at our history. It's the most amazing story.
Yeah. No, I think so because
it's one miracle after another. It shows... I mean, your parents, that they left like literally 4 days before the outbreak of the Second World War, when Poland was invaded. I've heard stories where people, when it was invaded and they heard the planes coming over, they thought this is a celebration. They didn't know that it was what was going to happen.
Yeah.
No one could foretell what the future was going to be. People thought that the Polish army was so strong and that it would never happen to Poland.
Yeah.
They must have been so insightful. Your parents must have had like a nebuah, they had like a prophecy what was going to happen.
Yeah, look, nobody could believe what would really happen. I mean, nobody believed 6 million gassing and concentration camps, etc. But he believed that the Germans will, it won't be a picnic, and they better get out. And he also published there was a Polish newspaper, Nowy Dziennik, where he also published in the 1930s. I haven't been able to put my hand on it. And there was supposedly one article where he wrote that we should get out of Europe.
Wow.
But then you have, parents who, who say, no, we're staying, and if you stay, we'll stay, and, everybody made their own decisions.
Can I ask, were your parents ever asked to give, to light on the Memorial Day, on Yom HaShoah, the candles, or were they asked to give talks about the experiences within the Jewish community?
They were interviewed, I think. That I know. That somebody, I don't know if it was Spielberg or who came to interview them in the house. That I know. I don't think that they, not that I know of, that they gave, but, it's been so many years. There might have been, and I'm not aware. I don't know.
And the original Sugihara visas, okay.
Yeah.
So I think your family has done, but the actual, you have the Curacao, do you have any of the documentation?
No, I just have the Lithuanian guide, whatever it's called, the thing that allows you to pass if you don't have a passport.
The litmus,
that's what we have, but we don't have the visas, and I don't know what happened to them.
But the original letters that you kept.
The letters from my
the correspondence.
The correspondence from my husband's grandparents and aunt to the family that had come to Palestine. We have those, and we gave them to the Holocaust Museum. But they made copies and translations of everything for us. So
today, the public can actually see it in the Holocaust Museum in Washington.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's a very big thing what you did by sharing it and donating it to the museum.
I think these things have to be, otherwise they're going to be lost, because first of all, even if they're kept in the house with the best of intentions, the climate change and everything, the paper doesn't last, and the ink doesn't last. And they have to be preserved in a museum, and it doesn't really matter which one, because today everybody is sharing also on the internet and et cetera, et cetera. I think whoever says no, we want to keep it for the next generation and the generation after, it'll get lost. I think it'll be lost to the Jewish people and to the world.
And I think with the stories with people, non-Jews and Jews, that they go to a museum and they see something that sparks such an interest and actually can be life-changing. When you see an original document or original artifact or something that was in Poland or survived the war,
absolutely,
people identify with original objects much more than with a picture sometimes. And it becomes very real. It becomes very real.
Absolutely. And also, the museum gives meaning to, somebody might have a patch from his, I'm just making up an example, from his uniform in a concentration camp, which is thrown in a drawer somewhere, which he kept it. The next generation won't know what that is, and it'll get lost. But if it's in a museum and it's put in an exhibit, it takes on all the meaning. And that's why I think these things have to be given. And I'm trying to convince all my friends who tell me they have this, they have that, it shouldn't stay at home.
So it was so nice. You were telling me that you had a Kiddush cup that your father, could you relate the story? Because I think it just epitomizes who your father was, who your family was. If you could just tell our listeners the story with this amazing Kiddush cup.
Well, in 1991 we went for the first time to Poland, my husband and I, and actually at that time we took our two youngest sons with us. And when we came back, I was the trip really moved me. We were in Krakow mainly. We were also in Warsaw, but Krakow for me has a very special place in my heart. And when we came back, I went to visit my father here in Jerusalem, and he was taking a siesta. And I came in, and I was really moved, and I told him we're back, and we saw this, and we saw that, and all the things he tried to tell me about, which I never listened to. And we saw the Wawel, which is the castle on the hill, and we saw everything, and the houses. Krakow wasn't destroyed. Krakow stayed as it was, so we saw all the places connected to the family, etc. And then he said, okay, go into the living room. I went into the living room. He said, open the silver cabinet, and I opened it. And he said, in the corner there's a glass Kiddush cup. Take that out, bring it to me. So I brought it to him, and I handed it to him, and he pushed my hand back, and he said, now this is yours, you deserve this now, because you went to Poland, and you show interest now. And this was given to me by a patient who survived the Holocaust, lost his whole family, had no children, nobody to give it to, and he was quite sick, and he gave it to me, to my father. I was his doctor, and he gave it to me for safekeeping, and I've kept it for many years, and now I give it to you because you finally deserve it, because you're showing interest, and I know that you'll take care of it.
This was incredible.
Yeah, and we did, until we realized, it's going to break one day. Somebody's going to clean that cabinet, and it's going to fall. And it's not just a glass, a Duralex glass that we can go and buy another one. So we wanted to give it to Yad Vashem. They weren't interested at that time, because they really didn't have the means also. I'm talking about like 20 years ago or more. And we ended up, I told the Holocaust Museum in Washington about it, and they said, we're grabbing this, and they were interested in everything, and they researched everything also. Today Yad Vashem is doing the same, but it was very moving, and he was very proud that we went, and that we saw, and that we showed interest, and that maybe the next generation will also hear about, and all my kids have been to Poland. So,
and now this Kiddush cup is in display in Washington.
Yeah, and it's on the internet as well, it can be seen. So, on their website. And they share with Yad Vashem a lot of things. So I felt badly, and she also, when the representative came from Washington. As she came, she said, "I've come to steal your stuff." And the next day, I suddenly, it was such an emotional meeting with her, and we were nervous in a way, because giving away these things was a very difficult thing, but we knew we had to do it. And then she said, "Look, I'm sure that the thing that you want to ask me is, why am I not giving this to Yad Vashem?" And she said, "So don't worry, because the first thing I'm going to ask you is to sign a paper that you agree to share everything with Yad Vashem. So it'll be preserved in Washington." Yeah, and it was quite an experience with her. She was really, anyway, but the next day, I suddenly said, "We gave her all these things and we never photographed the stuff. Are we crazy?" This woman came with a big black bag. She put all of our treasures, the letters of my husband's, grandparents from Poland until 1942, the Kiddush cup, everything was put into this big black bag like you would take to the shuk. I thought, what do we do? Are we crazy? We forgot to photograph everything. And I called her up. I tried to find her the next day, and I caught her on her cell phone. And she was in Beersheba at the time. She said, "Oh, I'm stealing from another family in Beersheba now. Your stuff is arriving in Washington in 17 minutes." Everything was already photographed before it went on the plane. Everything was, she said, "Don't worry, crazy, I wouldn't give it," and she said she personally meets the pilot of the plane, which is, I forgot which company that they use, like FedEx or something. She personally meets each pilot, hands him the stuff, tells her, etc. And she keeps track. And she said, in 17 minutes, in 17 minutes or something like that, it'll be on my desk in Washington, something like that. So I was relieved.
And are these letters displayed in the Holocaust Museum as well in Washington?
I would imagine, yeah, it goes. I haven't been there since, so I don't know. But yeah,
it would be amazing for you to go there and to actually see.
Absolutely.
What you donated.
And we did once with the Museum of Jewish Heritage. Years before that, they asked on loan if we could give them a loan of our parents' university degrees, and we gave it to them on loan. And after 5 years, they asked if we could, if we're interested in donating it, and we did. So it's there, and I've seen it there on exhibit, which is very exciting. And if it were at home, it would be stuck somewhere in a box, and the paper would be destroyed.
It's very noble, but it's, yeah.
It's, it sounds very nice. It's a nice idea to want to give it down in the generations, but I think it's better to have the copies of the things, and you can look at it, you can touch it. By the way, when we told the Holocaust Museum that we have stuff before we got to Washington, I wrote to them and asked if they're interested in general. And I told her we're coming to Washington, and that's when I wrote her an email at 2:30 in the morning, and she called me at 7. She said, "Get into a taxi now and come." But she told me, don't touch the stuff, don't read them, don't handle them, because the paper, will
disintegrate or get damaged.
Yeah, and there's another thing which reminds me of one of the letters there. There was a letter from, like I mentioned, my mother and my in-laws were classmates. And one of their classmates was in Lvov. 2 classmates were together in Lvov, and they sent a postcard also to Palestine to my in-laws in August. It was later on. It was during the first year of the war. And they both wrote on the postcards. The first one writes about he was using a lot of humor and a lot of codes, and they explained it to us in Washington exactly what each sentence meant when they're talking about. That was in some other letters, but he writes, "Oh, we're working and we're walking to work. Don't think we take a bus to work. We are walking, we're marching." We're in a very humorous kind of way and very sort of like optimistic. And then he signed his name Yusek. And then the other guy was also Yusek. One was Yusek Licht, one was Yusek Nussbaum. And then Yusek Nussbaum writes, and he writes, "The situation is terrible. there's no transportation anymore. There's no. You can see the difference in personality. You know, one was able to write with a sense of humor, and he knew it would be censored, so he wrote, you know, we're marching to work, we're proud to walk, and the other one wrote in a very different tone. And also many of the letters where Danny's grandparents would write something like, if you could send shoes size 41, that was a code that was used very often, because you couldn't write so-and-so is with me, you know, so 41, that's what the husband wore, you know, that's the size. There were lots of codes in the letters, because they couldn't write freely.
Wow, so just a message for our listeners, the letters that people have, the old letters that people sometimes will discard, it's got gems inside. Sometimes you read those letters and you're reading your history of one's family, and it's invaluable. So if one could just keep those letters and read them, and you'll never know what gems are inside those letters. And
without a doubt.
It's the most fascinating thing to read about your own history, and it sometimes is so well preserved in these letters.
Absolutely. But the originals should be either, you know, if it's something worth putting in a museum, it should be put there, if not, at least to digitalize them. Our son has been incredible. We have one of our sons lives in New York. Every time he comes, he brings an empty suitcase. He takes hundreds of photos with him. He doesn't even go through them. He sends them to a company, and everything has been digitalized.
Really?
Almost everything, because paper.
So in your family, you've instilled this knowledge of the Holocaust, this awareness, this...
I think so. I think, yeah. First of all, they know that I'm very much aware. They laugh at me sometimes, you know. So, what'd you buy, a book about the Shoah again, or, you know, etc. But, yeah, I think that they're aware. And as my parents always said, you know, when they tried to instill something in us, whether it was Hebrew or being Jewish or whatever, they always said if you give 500%, maybe 1% will last. You know, you have to keep trying. So every generation is different, and you know, young children aren't really interested, but hopefully when they get older.
But if you light a spark, you never know what will happen.
Yeah, you never know. And if the information is there and recorded somewhere, then that's what's important, I think. Because it's natural at a young age. When a kid is 10 and playing soccer, he's not, you know, not going to be all that interested. But later on.
Can I ask, when you went back to Krakow, did you have the address, or did you know where the house that your parents stayed?
We had every address.
Did you go visit the house? It's still there?
Absolutely. Everything is there. Everything is standing.
And who occupies it now?
Polish people.
Was it difficult did you meet the people or go in or see it?
Each time it was a little bit different. We never went into the apartment of any of them. We went into the courtyard and looked around. Sometimes, especially during the first visits in 1991, or 92 it was, I think. You know, you would see a lot of old people opening their curtain, looking down, seeing, and then closing the curtain. You know, maybe they were afraid that, you know, a stranger would come and we want to get the property. Yeah, we tried that, by the way.
Did it not work? They're reclaiming.
We had a Polish lawyer who was, you know, it was very problematic. If you really want to get it back, you've got to speak Polish, you've got to be there, you've got to know what you're doing, because, and everything has been nationalized, you know, and it belongs, some people have gotten back, but you have to spend a lot of time there and effort. We went to all the addresses every time of my in-laws.
It must be very difficult going back and seeing that this is once belonged to your family.
It's yeah, it's difficult to go there and see that it's.
But
it's not
they're
the
not there anymore.
Nobody's there. it's all, you know, it's all dead. Krakow is a wonderful city, vibrant. It's a university town. It's fantastic. But for us, it's
memories.
Nobody's left, and not because they went somewhere better.
They were forced to go.
They were pushed out and they were killed.
And the cemeteries are.
Yeah, we went to the cemeteries, but that we didn't spend much time on, and I'd like to do that because, you know, we had generations of people that were buried before the war. That there must be some. I think the archives now are available, and we can try and do that. We just have to do it. And yeah, it's. I think everybody should. It's important to know the family history, and I feel sorry when people just say, you know, why, for what, and it's a shame they're missing out, I think.
Well, Ruth, I just want to mention, I know for sure that your parents, especially your father, would be so proud of you relating the story, and to know that you have instilled this passion that you do have to your children and for future generations, and that the memory continues, and that their bravery, not only their bravery, their insight, what they did. It's if only we could all emulate that. That is something extraordinary.
They were lucky. It was a combination of insight, like you said, luck, and they managed, thank God. But they were one of the few.
Well, you come from a very special family, and I really want to thank you sincerely. It's been absolutely such an honor and a privilege really to hear your story.
Thank you.
And I really feel that your father's memoirs should be published. There's so much interest, and it's really, I think it's really important for not only the Jewish public but for everybody to read and to appreciate and to. I mean, it's a phenomenal, absolutely unbelievable story.
Yeah, I agree.
Anyway, thank you so much. I cannot thank you enough.
Well, thank you very much. It was really a pleasure and important. So thank you.